Let's do another example just to help show how we can use the address of operator. So there is another method in list that we can use that's called the find method. And what this does is it allows us to search for the first element in the list that meets a specific criteria. So notice there's kind of a trend here where if we have something that involves criteria, we're going to end up using the address of operator. So what we find is, well, no pun intended there, is that we can use the same approach as we did with the remove all method. So we're going to create a separate function that's going to return true or false. So if we're trying to find a specific element of some criteria, this other function that's set aside is going to contain that criteria that's going to be true or false. And then when we call the find method, we're going to use the address of operator to create that function delegate that's going to serve as the argument for that method. So in our example, let's suppose we have a list of strings. And let's say we want to find the first string that has 5 characters. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a function that returns true if the length of a particular string is 5. So let's take a look at an example of that. So let's say this is our function here. So we have private function check value as string, and then it's going to be as boolean to say that we're going to return true or false. So in our body, we just say return value.length equals 5. So remember, length gives us the size of the string. So value is string. So if the length of the string is 5, this is going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to return false. After creating our function for checking whether or not the string is length 5, we can then invoke our find method on that list. And what we would do is we would create the function delegate of that function, check in this case, by using the address of operator. If you couldn't tell by the name of the operator, what this essentially does is it gives us the address of that function. That's why it's called address of. So what we're really doing is when we say we're passing a function delegate, we're really passing the address of where that particular function is located. And what this will do is when we invoke the find method is it's going to give us the first occurrence of an element that has 5 characters in it. So let's take a look at some code to show what's going to happen here using our find method. So here we have a list of strings. So we have list as list of string equals new list of string, and then we're adding some strings. So we have dot, net, basic, thank, and you. And then underneath that, we have another string variable called val, and then we call list.find, and then in parentheses we have address of check. So once again, we're using address of here. So that's going to create a function delegate of the check function. So we're going to pass the address of that function. And what this means is we're basically calling check for each element in our list. So we're going to call the check function for dot. So we're going to pass the string dot to it. Then we're going to pass net, and then we're going to pass basic, and so forth. And we're just checking, is the length of each string 5? The first occurrence that this returns true is going to be the value that we store in the val variable. And we see that in this case, the first string that contains 5 characters, 5 characters, is basic. So basic is going to get stored in val. And then in the next line, we're going to display the contents of val in a message box. So this code is going to output basic in a message box. There is one more feature about lists that we want to mention, and that's called the count property. One of the issues so far is that we haven't gone over how to determine the actual size of our list. We know that we can put however many things we want, but what if we need to know how many things there are in there? Well, there isn't a length property, but there is a count property. So this works just like the length property for arrays, except now we're dealing with a list. So it just gives us the number of elements that would be in our list. So we can take a look at a pretty simple example here. So maybe we have a list of cars. So we call it car list. And it's a list of strings. And then we add several cars to this. So Toyota Camry, Honda Fit, Ford Focus, Chevy Corvette. We can add any other cars that we want. But we see that we add 4 things into our list. So when we do car list.count, right here, this is going to evaluate to 4 because it sees there are 4 things in here, and that's going to get stored in size. Therefore, our size variable is going to contain 4. We're now going to go back to our address of operator, and we're going to look at another feature that we can use this address operator for. We kind of mentioned this already, but very briefly, but we want to go into more details about it. Another application for the address of operator is we can map a function to an event handler. So we've seen how we can use the address operator to pass addresses of functions into another method. But what we can do is take an event handler and map a particular function such that whenever that event occurs, we call that corresponding function. So the format of this is pretty straightforward. We would have the keyword add handler, and then we would have the name of our tool, dot, and then whatever event we're dealing with. And then we'd have a comma, and then we would include address of, and then the name of the function that we want to map this with. So let me give you an example here. Let's say we want to create a new button, and this button would display a message whenever the button is clicked. We've already seen that we could double click on the button, and then there's another function, or we can actually go into the properties and create an event and then define the function there. But this is another approach we can use as well. So let's take a look at some code here on how we would map the function. So we create a button here that's called myB. So we have dim myB as button equals new button. And then the next line is where we do this mapping. So we do add handler myB.click, and then we have a comma, and then we have address of b clicked. So we have a function called b clicked, and that's going to be mapped with the event of clicking on this button. And then we see that we're going to add the button to our form as well. So the idea with this is whenever we click on the button that's labeled myB, we're going to automatically call the bClicked method. Now we should mention that this code should be added in a method that handles myBase.load. So that would be like our initial form handler, but we should put that there. That way we can create the button and add it to our form, so that way when the form is loaded, the button does display. It's kind of hard to interact with the button if it doesn't display on our form. Now, we still need to define what goes on inside of the bClicked sub procedure. So let's take a look at that. So here it's pretty straightforward. All we're going to do is just pop up a message box that says button is clicked. So whenever a person clicks on that particular button, they're going to get a message box with this message. We should mention that this sub does need to be included in the same class as the address of operator and where we're loading the form and creating the button. If you try to put it in another class, it's not going to work very well, especially since this is a private sub. We could make it public, but that's not necessary here. So just make sure that you include this sub in the same class as your button. So now we can take a look at the complete code to create a button and then have a message displayed whenever we click on it. So we have our form1load method. So this handles mybase.load. We see in this section right here that we're going to create a button. It's myB. We are going to map the bClicked method with the event of clicking on that button. So we have add handler myB.click, comma, address of bClicked. So that takes care of the mapping. And then we add the button to our form. And then we see down here that we have our method defined here, our sub-procedure defined, where whenever bClicked is called, we're going to display the message box. So this, sure enough, will create a button. And if the user clicks on the button, we'll get our message box.